As you can see, we have a full lineup for this morning. Our first panel is on building connections in the regional economy, and we have a wonderful set of panelists here. Look forward to that. We'll get right into that. Followed up by a panel on procurement, grant, and contracting opportunities. That should be very much looking forward to that. Then a short break, and then we'll have some breakout sessions on different opportunities. We have breakouts on kind of education and workforce funding that's out there that's able to be taken advantage of. We have one on building from our local technology base, some of the connections between our universities and our business community, and we have one on some opportunities in local energy and market, local energy finance and market opportunities. And then finally, we have a collaborative workshop to just sort of pull the different strings together. Talk a little bit about what we can do in the next 6 months to a year to really make these things happen and all get to work. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first panelist. And our first is Shelley Lawton is our moderator for our first panel. And thank you very much, Shelley. Shelley is the president of myregion.org, which is a program of the Central Florida Partnership, building connections and regionalism within the 7-county region here in East Central Florida. So, thank you much, Shelley.
It's supposed to be on. It's on? There we go. Good morning, everyone. Hey, can I start a point of personal privilege here so that we've got a little more energy in the room? Can I ask those of you who are way over there to come in a little bit so that our panelists can focus their conversation in a more energetic way? Again, my name is Shelley Lawton. I run an organization called myregion.org where, so this is kind of what I live and breathe every day, thinking about a regional economy and how do we make sure that Central Florida is a great place to live, learn, work, and play, right? Makes sense. So that's what we're going to have a conversation about for the next little while, and focus specifically on how do we take a concept like clean energy and think about how do we integrate what we're doing in every city, every county, and make sure we're really thinking so that we can compete at a global stage. That's the core, right? And let me just set some context. You know where you are, right? You're in Brevard County. And you're really close to the Space Coast. When we started our work a few years ago, it was amazing that when you think about Central Florida's place in the globe, there are two things that have led the way of us being known across the world. One of them is obviously right down the road, and that's space. What's the other one? The mouse. Or tourism. I would broaden it a little bit and say tourism. So no matter where you go around the world, when you say Kennedy Space Center or you say Walt Disney World or Central Florida, people know us for those two things. So we already have a global presence. Good morning. We talked a little bit about everybody moving over this way a little bit, if you could, please. So that's really important. We're already known across the world. And then we hone in on one county. So let me ask the question. Brevard County is where I was born and raised, and it is a county of how many people? How many people live? And 500,000. 500,000, right? So it's a great start. It's a great place to think about how do we capture this energy around energy. But now let's morph out a little bit. When we were going through a lot of the transition with CAPE, one of the grants that was received to really look at displacement looked at the population of where those workers typically lived. That then made us look at a 4-county region: Volusia, Brevard, Orange, and Seminole, right? That's where there's a lot of people who live, learn, work, and play from Kennedy Space Center. Think about that. There are more people, as a matter of fact, who go from Titusville to Waterford Lakes to shop than they could do to stay in the county and go down to Melbourne. Kind of interesting as we think about our economy. So 500,000 people who live in Brevard County. Now, when you take in these 4 counties, what's the population? It's about 2.5 million people. So already, look at the power of going from 1 county to 4 counties. You take it to my 7 counties that we typically think about in terms of the economy, that grows to 3.7 million people. Think about the power of that if we learn how to harness the economic opportunities and the possibilities of how we connect this region to the world at large. Now, I'm going to give you one other data point to think about. When you now expand this to our super region, so 15 counties from coast to coast, we are the 10th largest economy in the United States. Did you know that? Did you know that? Think about that. 10th largest economy in the United States, and we have not figured out how to harness that power. But I am here today with a panel of experts to say this is an opportunity with energy to harness this power in a way that could make clean energy become the next global thing that we're known for around this world. What a possibility, right? So let me ask you before I introduce our panelists, a little show of hands. How many of you in the room today work in private sector companies? Okay. How many of you are in some kind of civic organization, a business group, okay? How many of you are in local government or state government organizations? Okay. So we've got a lot of, we got a mix, but primarily business, private business. Give me 3 things you want to make sure that this panel talks to you about today. Give me 3 things that you're really curious about as we talk about this setup of regional collaboration. Yes, sir. And introduce yourself so we know who you are.
Hi, I'm Stephen Webster with MW Consulting in Tallahassee. We deal with relating to past lives of a lot of this. The question is how you take regional initiatives such as and you work them in state and federal policy.
Okay.
So the government basically is on the same page for once.
Okay, so how do we align what's happening at the local level, the regional level, the state level, and lo and behold, the federal level? Okay, right? What else? So that's one. Panelists, you're writing these down, right?
Well, what he said, and also,
please introduce yourself.
David Teague. I was also one of the guys helping to coordinate this panel. I work with the consortium. Also, we have different kind of strength areas in the different counties and the different parts of the region. How can we go after really big projects where everybody's doing what they do well, and we have a whole that's bigger than the sum of the parts, and it's a win-win instead of a zero-sum when we go after economic development opportunities.
Okay. How do we do this together so that it's more than just a zero-sum game? All right? Yes. Yes, sir. Please.
Lawrence Maxwell, Space Coast Architect. How do we get the legislature in Florida to pay attention and create an energy policy for the state that allows all that are here forward?
Okay, great. Energy policy for the state. Critical issue if we're going to pursue this in any large-scale way. Right. Okay, great. Panelists, we got all that? Here's how we'll do this, because most of what we want to do today is have the conversation, not spend a lot of time telling you about organizations. So what I've asked the panelists to do is self-introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their organization if you're not familiar with them already, and specifically what they're doing to help focus their organizations on this idea of clean energy, and then we'll get into lots of conversations and questions that you might raise. Griff, may I ask you to start?
Sure. Good morning. Look, I can't tell you how excited, from the state level, Griff Salmon, Executive Vice President with Enterprise Florida, and I can't tell you how excited from the state level we are to see this kind of opportunity, and for y'all coming together and at least exploring these approaches. You know, from economic development, as you approach it, it changes every day. We looked a long time at site location, but what we really should be looking at is area location, because that's what companies are looking for. They have too much information at their fingertips. You've got states and communities that are ultra aggressive, ultra competitive, and they no longer have to look at one site. They're looking at multiple opportunities. And so if we're not marketing ourselves from an area, a region, a consortium, if you will, then we're already behind the eight ball. The neat thing is that you're ahead of the game because you're exploring these opportunities. People are doing this around the Southeast and the country, and we're getting into that game, and I think it's important. And what I really want to talk to you about today, and we can get into that a little bit later, is why it's important and examples of things that are going on around the country and things that we can look to emulate. Full disclosure, I've been on the job about 3 months. I spent the last 16 years in economic development with a competing organization, and we won't delve into that. But I tell you that to tell you that I'm learning, and I'm getting my feet wet in a hurry, and we all have to be, because Florida's economic development goals are extremely aggressive. Governor Scott's plan for 700,000 jobs in 7 years sounds like a staggering number, but the exciting thing for us is it's well within our grasp. So as we move forward today, think about the things that you have to compete in clean tech industry or other industries. You define what you're good at. We've got incredible natural resources. We've got very diverse research and development capabilities, and we have a focus on commercialization. You take all those things into consideration, and we can compete in just about anything. And so as we move forward with this and we start looking at it, let's take what the state organization is doing, and in answer to your question about how they are partnering with the locals. You know, EFI is probably, and I'll admit this, probably a little bit behind in our approach towards clean tech. In 2010 was when we defined clean tech as a targeted industry. And that's behind the rest of the country. But we're rapidly catching up. Last year in FY 2011, because we defined it as a targeted industry, over 9% of all the companies utilizing incentives in the state of Florida were in the clean tech industry. Created about 1,600 jobs, about $350 million in investment, and they're paying higher than the average state wage. We can do better, and we have to do better. And so our focus from the state EFI standpoint and working with you is taking advantage of your organizations like this and bringing people together and figuring out how we can be more competitive and how we can raise those numbers. And so that's why today I think is so important, getting to the bottom of how we move forward and be more competitive. The trick for us, and this is not easy, and it's hard when you start talking about regionalism, is convincing local officials, state officials, legislature, everybody else that it's good for the whole, and that if you don't do this and you aren't part of a collaboration, then you're not going to be competitive. And what I think we'll hear today through the panel is we'll be able to talk about examples, and you'll see what some of our competitors are doing, and how if we don't get on board with that and we don't educate our people how important it is, we're going to struggle. An example of everybody being in this room today is why I feel confident that we can get there. And I appreciate and applaud your efforts just to be here and to hear these conversations. And I look forward to discussing with you today.
Great. Thanks, Griff. Jay, I think you're next on the slide, so if you would please, let's hear what's going on at NASA in this regards, and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Good morning, my name is Jay Edelman. I'm a former reformed shuttle systems engineer, worked in program management, project management. First of all, it's very humbling, no matter how smart you are in school, to work with NASA, and even to be on this panel sitting next to Griff. I don't know how to top that. Good Lord.
Hey, Jay, can you speak up just a little bit? Thank you.
It's really humbling to work with the people I work with every day. And so I work in the Center Planning and Development Office. I'm a manager at the Spaceport Planning Office. We have a very talented master planning team. We're in the middle of our new master planning efforts to set the 20-year future vision for the Kennedy Space Center and where we're going to take the Kennedy Space Center, given the change in the program of record and the challenges we've got at the end of the shuttle program. We're working very closely with the state of Florida. We've even been working with Secretary of Agriculture Putnam's office on how to help them with their energy initiatives. We've toured him around the center. He's looked at it. We've got a great center. We want to make sure our plan is sensitive to our biodiversity. We have the National Park Service is very proud of our center, having 15 endangered species on the center and the 140,000 acres that we have that we manage. It's the most of any of the national parks across the country. Yet we still go launch these large rockets, and everybody thinks rocket business is big, nasty, dirty, brutish things, but I think rocket engines have been the cleanest energy we've had on the shuttle in the history of the country. We are working actually with the state to align our master plan policy with the state's master plan. Space is a new mode of transportation. The Florida Department of Transportation has accepted. As far as we can tell, we're the only quintimodal transport hub in the world. We're going to try to figure out how do we make the most of that and develop in our center. So I look forward to discussing ideas and opportunities with you, and keep in mind the Spaceport Planning and Development Office is the front door to Kennedy Space Center, and we are working to transform Kennedy Space Center from being a service consumer of contractors who come out and do work for us to becoming a service provider.
Great. Thanks, Jay. So we talked about alignment, state and federal sitting right next to one another, so we'll keep talking about that.
Can you believe it?
And we're nice to each other.
And our next two panelists will really focus their efforts at the local level, but again, we'll want to hear about their ideas on how to broaden that to a regional. Oh, I'm sorry, Jay, did you want to go through these slides right now, or did you want to?
We can if you'd like.
Do you want to do that real quick before we?
Just flip through them real quick.
Okay, great.
There's only about 3 or 4 slides.
There we go.
This is what I've been talking about. If you want to read them later, you can. We were awarded a 2009 GSA award for innovative partnership, working with the Florida Power and Light to create a 10 megawatt generation solar capacity on the center. In return, they gave us a 1 megawatt power generator on our site, on our side of the meter, and it helped us meet our executive order goals dating back some many years to reduce our energy consumption from the grid. And then, of course, we're in the process of creating Exploration Park with Space Florida. The idea being that we're going to create an industry hub that can be adjacent to the Kennedy Space Center, but just outside of our security gates, but still have the opportunities to work with the center to grow your businesses. And I'm really, personally, I'm very excited about this from the aspect of I'll stack our workforce in this area up against any workforce in the country. And I always hear all these things about Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. We got South Brevard County as a technical hub. We've got a great technical hub in East Central Florida with UCF and the research campus out there. And it seems like the only thing lacking is that connecting hub. How do we create that? So my hope is that Research Park will become that fulcrum of the triangle that's going to bring those areas together. And granted, we can't go live in the ocean, so we can only expand westward and southward and maybe a little bit north to Volusia County. But I really believe it's going to make a difference in the area once we get this up and running.
Great. Thank you so much. Robert, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what's going on here at Florida Space Coast?
Hi, thank you very much for having me on the panel this morning. My name is Rob Salonen. I'm a Director of Business Development at the Economic Development Commission of Florida Space Coast. And as an organization, we're charged with really 3 things. And how we fit into, our challenge sometimes is how we fit into the state and federal initiatives that are out there. But we're charged with trying to reduce the cost and aggravation of businesses that want to create jobs and invest in the Space Coast in particular. We work specifically with businesses to do that, to bring businesses from outside the area into the Space Coast. We work with our existing businesses here. We also work with, on a regional level and a state level, some of our partners on how do we influence policy? How do we influence policy on a state and local level to help those businesses reduce their aggravation and cost? And finally, what we do is we try to promote the area to the rest of the world, the rest of the country that we're competing with. These megapolitan regions you may have heard about, we recognize that we are competing as a Florida high-tech corridor with other areas of the world. It is not just the United States. It's not just a Brevard County, Orlando, Brevard County, Volusia. We recognize that. The challenge is, how do we reconcile our goals? How do we say, well, we're going to help this particular company, and we're helping dozens of those companies every day, and then how do we have the resources to then promote regionalism, take part of that, those regionalism efforts? Part of the structure that we enjoy is having the Energy Consortium that's growing here locally that we're part of. I was looking at the agenda yesterday and today, and I think I counted about 90% of the organizations that were listed on the agenda we've worked projects with in particular. And so part of our regionalism efforts are to be a part appropriately of all of these initiatives that are going on and still satisfy our constituents' needs.
Thank you so much. Carrie, you want to tell us what's going up on Volusia County's way?
Sure thing. And Shelley, I have some slides. Can I operate it from that computer over there, you think?
I think so.
I was, okay. I was going to forego slides in light of everyone else, but then I decided, since we're trying to figure out regionally how we work together, it seems like to familiarize you with Volusia County would be helpful. So I am Carrie Samolin, and I am the interim president and CEO for Team Volusia Economic Development Corporation. Team Volusia incorporated in August 2010, so we are a relatively new public-private organization for economic development in Volusia County, which is centered which is on the eastern border of the state. We're bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the east, St. Johns River to the west, and that puts us nicely in between Orlando, Jacksonville, and of course you find folks here in the Space Coast. And we are fortunate to have such ease of access to these major markets due to 23 miles of Interstate 4 and roughly 30 miles of I-95. They intersect in Daytona Beach. We are recognized as a metropolitan statistical area. That's Deltona, Daytona Beach, Ormond Beach, 13 other cities, brings us to nearly 500,000 in population. So what do people know about Volusia County? Well, there is definitely name recognition in Daytona Beach, and of course NASCAR, the 500 Speed Weeks happening the end of this month. But what Team Volusia tries to do is leverage that brand recognition, take it a step further, and really talk about the vitality of our business community. We not only have NASCAR events, but we are the corporate headquarters for NASCAR and the International Speedway Corporation. We have the corporate headquarters for Brown & Brown. They just met their $1 billion revenue mark. Their chief executive rang the bell at NASDAQ just a couple weeks ago. We are home to several universities. Embry-Riddle Aeronautical, they have an FAA next-gen test bed that's located there. They are building out a research park. Stetson University, Daytona State College with the Advanced Technology Center. That's Bethune-Cookman, and we are Seminole and Knights friendly. FSU College of Medicine has a facility next to our state college, and we just opened up our first UCF business incubator that is adjacent to our international airport. Our K through 12 is recognized 1 out of 18 in the country by the Ford Foundation as a next generation learning community. And we have a host, kind of a diverse mix of manufacturing for our economic base. Probably most notable is Energizer Personal Care. They do the Hawaiian Tropics products, suntan lotions. That's coming out of Ormond Beach. So Volusia and clean energy. And I asked this question, we did a little conference call with our panel. What do we mean by clean energy? You know, as a local government, they've been certified silver through the Florida Green Building Coalition for installing LED lights or using fuel-efficient cars, fleets. They got some money through the stimulus funding to launch Green Volusia and Sustainable Volusia. So certainly our community understands, embraces, and pursues the environmental benefits of clean energy practices. From an economic development standpoint, however, Team Volusia is really focused on trying to understand, okay, as a nation, we do know that, reliance on oil, decreasing that's going to make our market less volatile. But where are the jobs coming from? How can we create companies? And similar to Griff, our focus is definitely on research and development, really making sure there's commercialization of technology and clean energy that's going to create those jobs. Thanks, Shelley.
Great, Carrie, thanks so much. And that kind of gives you a context of, again, the focus in Volusia County. Our last panelist, Regenerate. Linda Fowler is the president of that organization. And if you haven't met Linda yet, she's really doing some exciting work here in Central Florida. Linda, tell us a little bit about that.
Great, thank you. Great to be here. Well, I had the privilege of spending the last year on the Space Coast under a Space Florida contract looking at 5 high-growth clusters for the region. And those 5 high-growth clusters, one of those is clean energy, obviously, and the work that we did with the Space Coast Energy Consortium has resulted in attracting some federal funding to do more in this space, and I think that's very exciting, and it's exciting to see the growth of that organization over the last year. I also would not have anticipated going into that project necessarily that there are some real opportunities on what I call the edges or the boundaries. So I think where we're going in phase 2 of this work is really looking at the convergence of those clusters like aerospace and clean energy, like healthcare and IT, like aerospace and medicine. And so thinking about the nexus of those clusters is where I am very optimistic about this region in particular, how you can leverage your assets. And we looked at data that indicated that there are incredible market opportunities, and then you bringing your own assets and your passion and energy to the table allow us to think about how we can actually forge some of those strategic partnerships across this region. I also wanted to share that I'm working in some other regions around the country that are trying to do the same thing. My firm does specialize in economic competitiveness and regional collaboration. I partner often with other firms and universities. I also I have a very broad portfolio of clients, which you might appreciate, including philanthropy. So in some states like Michigan, which is my home state where I grew up, Flint, Michigan, my hometown, which has been devastated by a decline of the auto industry, Southeast Michigan also going through a major transition. In those areas, philanthropy has decided that it needs to pick up the ball and invest in economic competitiveness. So what does that look like? It sometimes is focused on funding high-tech accelerators. It sometimes is funding connective tissue between the universities, the higher education institutions, the hospitals, et cetera. So really thinking about how some regions have pulled together the public-private partnerships to support economic, in some cases, transformation and revitalization. I'm doing a lot of work in Colorado where they're also looking at how to link aerospace and clean energy. NASA is at the table there, which is very exciting. There's a representative from this region, as a matter of fact, who will be on loan to Colorado, and that is a state initiative. And there we're looking at how we can actually leverage NASA technology across all 10 space centers to both provide those technologies to small and medium-sized companies that might benefit from those, but also thinking about how those suppliers in that region might be able to benefit NASA in terms of being able to manufacture certain things that they're looking for their space mission. So thinking about the Colorado connection, I think there's a lot of potential synergy between connecting those clusters and this cluster. So I'm hoping that we can do some meaningful intentional networks across those regions. I'm also working in Milwaukee, where they have a very strong industry cluster focused on water, and they have begun to think about the nexus between water and energy, which is very powerful, and I think there's some opportunities there. I'm also working in Northeast Ohio with NASA Glenn, and they have a very strong focus on the advanced manufacturing initiative that we heard about yesterday. And I think, you know, the fact that the NASA Space Centers are working together to support the linkage between modeling and simulation and IT as it supports manufacturing is another area of opportunity. So I also I'll close with this, that I'm hoping that in addition to mining lessons learned from some of the other regions where I've worked and bringing those to the Space Coast, making some connections between regions that have very similar interests. I think it's also very important to think about the alignment issue that someone brought up earlier in terms of the federal, state, regional, local. So my intent is to also continue to forge strategic partnerships with the federal government, and that cuts across many agencies. The Department of Energy recently shared with me that they have a very strong interest in connecting NASA and Department of Energy, so I think there's a real opportunity there. EDA is obviously still very interested in this region. NIST, federal lab in both Boulder and in Gaithersburg, Maryland, outside of DC where I live, is very interested in thinking of ways to support new technologies that are cross-cutting, transformative, have broad application in advanced manufacturing. So that's another area of opportunity. So my goal is to bring some of those federal partners here, to have a dialogue with them about what are those opportunities where you can be aligned with their mission and their priorities, and those often will, I think, support your economic development agenda here.
Thank you, Linda. You know, it's so interesting. This panel, I think, is really bringing up a structural issue that I need the audience's help with as I ask them a specific question about this. All right, the business community, or really everybody in the room, of the 4 counties that we talked about as part of this consortium, how many of you are doing business in at least 3 out of the 4 of those counties right now? Okay. How many of you are only doing business in 1 county right now? How many of you are doing business in at least multiple counties, minimum of 4 counties? Right? All right. One of the challenges that I think we face that I would really like this group's response to is that while business jumps over county lines and city lines and regional lines and state lines, national lines, to do business, the way we tend to fund and organize our economic development approaches tend to be based on government boundaries. Where have you seen great, and panel, this is for you, where have you seen great examples of boundary jumpers as it relates to really building regional strategies for economic development, and what could we learn from them? Panel?
Well, I'll take a couple. Across the Southeast, I think you'll see it's prevalent. And part of this is out of necessity. You look at some of the smaller states in the Southeast and around the country, they started to try to figure out how could they compete on a global scale. And we talked about globalization earlier. It's not just competing down the street anymore. So how are you going to compete on a global scale when you don't have the resources and you may not have everything that company needs, or that you've identified their drivers and you can't handle all that by yourself? So out of necessity, a lot of these states and local governments have come together and tried to figure out, hey, how can we compete? Well, the only way we can compete is if we pool our resources. And y'all have heard about the story on what you're supposed to do if you see a grizzly bear. No? Hold your hands over your head and try to make yourself appear bigger than you really are. It's the same principle in economic development. And so a couple of true examples of that. You look at some of the partnership between some of the states and funds that are being sent across lines. ThyssenKrupp in Mobile, you had basically a 3-state process where people realized that employees would be coming from out of that area, and there's a benefit to the surrounding communities. So those local partnerships got together and tried to figure out how they could do it. Incredibly difficult, and a lot of pushback on a lot of these, because you've got to convince local officials that are looking for votes and otherwise that it's good to send your money to another county, which is never easy. But when you start to see the benefit of your employees working right next door, a source of revenue that wouldn't have been there had you not competed on that scale, it makes a huge difference.
Okay. Linda?
I'll just share 2 examples. One is a current example in southeast Michigan, where you have a town like Ann Arbor, Michigan, if any of you are familiar, the home of the University of Michigan, which is really thriving, and communities such as Detroit, where they are facing public lighting, challenges in terms of blackouts in their downtown, right? So very different set of challenges. There's a group of folks that have economic development professionals that have been asked to come together over the last couple years to work together. And the seed money came from philanthropy, and they were told to collaborate. Well, they've been meeting for over a year, and they hadn't figured out how they might collaborate. So I started working with them about 2 months ago, and the first thing that I brought to the table was some data, because I felt that without that, they really weren't going to be able to have an informed strategy around how they might work together. And what we were able to identify was an $800 million market opportunity in the region. So a demand within the region of 6 counties that essentially would require them to work together and form a network that supported these suppliers for electronic parts. $800 million demand, $660 million coming from outside the region. And as a community, a set of communities, and as a region, they had 17 times the national average of suppliers that could provide that product. So that's a real concrete opportunity that they're going to go after together, and it is going to require all of them working together to be able to go after that market opportunity. Secondly, in the Piedmont Triad in North Carolina, where I've also done some work, they have their largest revenue generator is a furniture mart. It's a one-time event, an annual event, brings in a lot of outside visitors, a lot of business. They experienced the threat of that going away to Las Vegas and China. And based on that short-term threat, the 3 mayors in the room that are typically very competitive realized that if they didn't come together around that short-term threat, that they were going to lose out on that revenue. And the other thing we provided them was a long-term opportunity, which was a FedEx, an Airtropolis, which they were successful in getting. And they also knew that if they didn't work together in terms of tax incentives and building roads and all the things that were required to create that hub and that Airtropolis, that they would not be successful. So I think sometimes the short-term threat and the long-term opportunity are very motivating, and also the data that drives a very specific market opportunity can be very motivating.
Okay, great. Others of you? Robert?
Yeah, I think part of what our challenge is, we have to identify what the end game is for our constituents, our investors, and our organization. And we have to be able to prove that out. And so we've been able to do that with certain projects that we're working with. We can never really forget why our organization is here. But at the same time, we're very willing to go out and work projects. Very specifically was the Semitech project that came about last year, and we were competing with federal funds, and New York was certainly a competitor. That was a very specific example of how the structure already existed with the University of Central Florida. And the teams came together from various counties in the region, and our county commission was very supportive of the effort for that project. So while, again, it's from a strategic point of view, sure, we're supportive of regionalism. But this was a very specific project that at the end of the day, we were able to bring back what the benefits would be to our area and say, well, look at that. Look how we can be part of this regional effort for this specific project. And there are other projects that are in the works that are not similar necessarily, but we're crossing lines. But we have to remember that our constituents, our investors, are going to say, oh, why are you spending your time doing that? And as long as we're smart enough to say, oh, well, look, this is the immediate result of our participation in the effort, your immediate result for your tax dollars supporting this effort. And then look, this is how it supports regionalism. This is how we can all grow bigger together. That's been helpful for us as we move forward.
So underscoring what Linda said about short-term urgency, long-term opportunity, long-term upside. I had a question over here, and if you could stand and identify yourself, please.
I'm with Big Energy in Tallahassee, and it's a comment that they're hoping it's aimed at Griff to expand on. And it's your energy policy question goes back to that. Keep in mind, nobody owned energy in Florida until October when they put it with the Department of Agriculture. Patrick Sheehan, you now have an executive director of the Office of Energy really for the first time.
Well, let me, we've got a question over here, but let me piggyback on that so that we get some answers around this policy issue. Without an energy policy in Florida, a stated energy policy, what is the downside? And is that something that this region could coalesce around to ensure that we get some alignment at local, regional, and state levels? Want to respond to that? Everyone?
Well, I'll do my best.
Okay.
From that standpoint, I think there is an energy policy. There's not a renewable standard. And so it's different because there's only about 26 of the 50 states that have a renewable standard. Lots of them have energy policies. There's a big difference between the two. It is always a difficult proposition. Do we have any of our power providers, energy providers, anybody? Okay, then you know what I'm saying, because at the end of the day, a renewable standard will require you to do certain things, which has wonderful effects and a broad-reaching effect. The interesting part of that is there's always give and takes with everything, and so you have to consider what it does to the actual power buyer, and that power buyer is all of us. You know, if you do this and you look at examples in other states, the trick is you take some of the most aggressive states in the country about this. I think it's California has 25 for 25 or something like that, where they're going to have 25% by 2025. Incredibly aggressive policy, very forward thinking. The issue is what you're starting to find with some of the backlash is what it's costing the actual consumer, and that's us, as they buy from the power providers. So there has to be a wonderful balancing act. You talk about redistricting and some of the other things are coming. What you don't want to do is jump out there in front of it and make the wrong far-reaching policy and us pay for it forever. So there is some due diligence that has to be done. It's not a good excuse, and it's not the one that we want to hear. But there is good reason that we don't have one in place today.
Okay, Linda?
So I would just say that I do work with some states that have very aggressive renewable energy policies, like the state of Colorado. But I also work with mayors. I work with cities, like the city of Chicago. The mayor of Chicago put in place what I would call one of the most innovative green market-driven strategies around sustainability and energy efficiency. So I personally would say that while you're working toward the end game of doing the due diligence around what it might look like for the state policy, it doesn't mean that you can't at the local and regional level begin to think about how you can set standards and have a strategy that is focused on economic development but drives green job growth, drives environmentally sustainable strategies. So I would offer that up as a you know, on the same path, sort of at the same time, you can begin to do both.
Okay, great. Question down in front?
Yeah, I'm Dale Kessler with Space Florida, UCF, and the local EDC. And it dawned on me listening to you all, we probably need to have a real clear ask, because in November we have a presidential election, and that I-4 corridor, which you are all a part, is the single most important piece of political real estate in the entire country. And we have an opportunity to get, if we have specific, just more specific the better, but even a general ask of the presidential candidates. We worked that pretty well 4 years ago on a space issue. And I think, you know, we had Newt sort of overshot it, and now we've got Romney and Santorum really with very tepid responses to the space issue, which is going to drive them back here to be more clear, to appeal to the voters of the I-4 corridor. And if absent that, we can't keep pressure on the White House to match that enthusiasm. So I think it would behoove all of us to work together to figure out what exactly is it we want the federal government to do, whether from a Democrat or a Republican, because this opportunity goes away in 6 months. So it probably behooves, and I don't have an answer off the top of my head.
I was going to ask you that. What's your recommendation?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just a commitment to help. It's just a publicly acknowledge the resources, the capability, the ease of the transition of the workforce from space into clean energy, blah, 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 blah. Just something that we can hold whoever is successful in the campaign, hold them to account. Because like we had both Obama and McCain come here and promise they were going to save us on the space issue. We all knew that that really wasn't possible, but we got the promise. And now we had the administration, McCain got lucky and lost, so we didn't have to live up to the promise. Obama stuck with that, so he's got to match it. And the budget for KSC they issued this year was pretty darn good. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact he knows that his statements here are going to be a television commercial in the I-4 corridor. It's a question whether it's going to be for him or it's going to be run by the Republic. And we need to figure out how we leverage that opportunity in clean energy for the candidate, for both candidates, whomever they are, going into the future, because this is an opportunity that comes around once every 4 years.
Okay. Question back here.
Shannon Roberts, and I'm a former local elected official, also a retired NASA person and a regional planner. So the reason I was going to pick up on Linda's point, which was to talk with the local officials and help them perhaps take the lead. I find that some of our local officials may not have an awareness of some of the opportunities, so it might suggest an opportunity for a forum for some of our local communities to understand exactly what we do want, which obviously this conference is enabling. But I think if we targeted it towards the city leaders, that might help them become more aware of what we might want on a regional basis.
Okay.
The other thing, going back to the energy policy that Griff is mentioning, when we had a meeting with local aerospace industry leaders, they were just saying in order for the Space Coast to really advance and provide opportunities to attract businesses here, support entrepreneurial endeavor, that the state of Florida, ironically, is a sunshine state, to not have an energy policy is a true missed opportunity. So even, whatever it may be, even if it's just that we, have something that embraces the value of clean energy, it would help a great deal. And these are companies, as we know, all across the world in terms of their leadership, and it was a common thing, it was a united voice that the state of Florida needs an energy policy. So I would just suggest, I heard that from the audience, yesterday.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this: when we say we need an energy policy, do we need? Are we talking about an energy policy or a renewable standard? I mean, are we?
Well, this distinction in this particular community.
You're exactly right.
I think they're saying energy policy because, as was mentioned, one of the few states in the country that would be looked to for leadership in energy, and we don't have one. It's kind of like what is.
And I ask that question to you because I think that's our issue. It's education. How do we educate everybody what actually we're thinking as far as an energy policy? Do we need to go to a renewable standard? How do we approach this? It's an education standpoint so that everybody knows and is talking the same language. And I think that's half of our battle.
Vocabulary really does matter.
Right.
Vocabulary matters, what we mean when we say that. We've got time for one more question. I can't believe this has gone by so quickly. John?
John Porter, co-chair of the Space Coast Energy Consortium. Thank you, panel, very much for being here today and all the rest of you. Quickly on the energy policy issue, really, we're kind of beating around the bush. I mean, here we have basically a flawed system, in my opinion, here in Florida, because you have investor-owned utilities that basically, when we conserve energy and put LED lighting in, they sell less power, they make less profit. So there's a real problem. There's a fundamental flaw in the structure of our utility system. The utilities lose when we win.
Yeah.
We lose when they win. Somehow you have to have a fundamental shift in how we produce and sell and use energy in Florida, or we're going to keep beating each other up in Tallahassee. And quite frankly, we've got lots of great bills and lots of great programs, but they get blown up either by the utilities or by people hopefully looking out for the consumer. But having said that, let's push that aside for a minute. But until you deal with that problem, I think there's
3.7.
3.7, I'm sorry. That's a very big market. It's a very big consumer market. We talked a lot, or yesterday, and probably a little more today, about R&D, about advanced manufacturing, about sales and marketing. But what we haven't talked a lot about yet is that we are sitting on a very big market for our own products if we could open up the market. And how do you open up the market? That's a really good thing to talk about. And you do that through local governments coming together and creating our own policy that says we want to go 20% renewable and energy efficient by 2020. You know, don't wait for the state. You know, we know what the problem is at the state. You got an IOU issue, investor-owned utility issue, and a consumer issue. And the money's big, and the fights are big, and nothing gets done. And hopefully it will get done in the next year. So what can we do as a 3.7 million person market? We could have our own policy that would cover this region, which could, you know, introduce demand. And then once we have demand, then all you folks that want to create widgets and sell widgets now have a local market to sell into.
So John,
finance is a key point, and if you all come to my panel in a little while, we'll discuss finance. There's my, and it really is. It's going to come down to money, and finance is important. That a homeowner, or business owner, or municipality can finance clean energy, energy efficiency, and that's what's going to spur our economy and spur the business and buy widgets from the people that want to develop those widgets.
So John, let me ask you, are you saying the Energy Consortium could own that as a goal?
No, I didn't say that. I like the way you said that. No, that's not, we certainly should provide leadership, but that's something that our board would have to take up. But creating a regional energy policy would be a great idea and would help to drive all the other pieces of this clean energy economy.
And I'm getting the nod that we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask the panelists to answer one last question, because I do think John's bringing up a question, and it's a conundrum that I face every day trying to get the region to work together on a variety of issues, which is, who owns this? Because when nobody owns what an initiative is, it does not move forward. So I'm going to ask this panelist to answer this question from your perspective. You're queen or king for the day in this region, and you really want to make sure that this idea of regional collaboration on building this clean energy cluster happens. What could you do? What could you suggest we do tomorrow to start along this path, and what's your organization willing to do to help support it? Griff, start with you.
Wow. Very good, huh? I tend to believe imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And I think if I was king for a day, I'd make the entire group start looking at groups that have tackled this issue and been successful. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't read you one quote that I think is probably the best example of this. Very quickly, and this just happened, I just pulled this up, a copper manufacturer located in a county in the southeast. It was originally stated to locate in another county right next to that in a city. It grew to the point where the site could not contain it. The current city who had the project started working with all the other counties around it and took the incentives that they were going to put into it and ended up finding a county, one county over, and somehow put their incentives into that and located a $100 million facility and 50 jobs. The quote that I want to read you is, this is from the Thomasville mayor. This is the mayor that had to tell his constituents, I am fixing to put money into another county to make this project happen, and I think it's incredible. After announcing the project in Thomasville last year, the company found it needed a much longer site. We partnered with the neighboring county, proving that county lines should never be a deterrent in luring projects to a region in X state. I won't go over the state. But from that standpoint, what I would do if I was king for a day is I would hammer that mayor and figure out how he did it. How were you able to convince your entire county that this was a good idea? The other counties, you name it, how did you convince them, and how can we take that and use that for our own? Because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take practices where people can see a positive impact.
Griff, thank you. Jay?
You know,
king for the day.
I think the law doesn't allow me to be king for a day under the Hatch Act.
I'm going to change that law just for the moment.
Okay, but you know, having said that, you know, we do need to reach out and cooperate across the county lines and across geographic lines. And how do you do that as a consortium? You know, there's benefit in people having less power consumption on their houses, because then you don't need as many emissions from the power plants, and so therefore you need less power plants in the neighborhoods. How do you force people to want to cooperate? You know, you can't. There's a carrot and a stick, and so you got to find some carrots out there to encourage people to want to do things. Now, the federal government, we have executive orders that force us to go get more green power, and we built that. We built a facility that's a LEED Platinum facility on the center that puts more energy into the grid than it actually consumes, but they're not cheap, so we have to find ways to make alternative energy sources affordable and on par with non-renewable energy sources.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Robert?
I think, again, I have to come back to the doable deed. You know, when we look at legislation, when we look at project work, what can we do to get the ball rolling, and how can then we leverage that in the future? Those were some of the same questions that Governor Scott's transition team asked Linda Weatherman a couple years ago when he was coming in. You know, how can we take a look at energy policy or energy standards? And the education component came right back around, and who is going to win and who is going to lose. So what can we do instead of throwing the Hail Mary pass of we want this for the legislation and the end zone's way down there? What can we do to get to the 10-yard line? And then how can we march it down the field?
Okay.
And coalesce the coalition around it? How can we build that? Okay. And building those relationships, that mayor probably had those relationships that went back years. How can we leverage our relationships with the universities, I think, in particular, to get everybody coalescing around the same goal?
Okay. Do you have one doable deed that you'd recommend we tackle first? Think about that. We'll go to Carrie. If you think of one, come back to you. Carrie?
So, queen for the day, I maybe would ask the consortium to lead the charge, and the reason being, even in this discussion, it's clear that we do need to understand, you know, all be on the same page in terms of clean energy versus renewable portfolio standard, very, very separate things. And I keep separating it in my mind as an economic development organization, as there are some existing technologies out there that help with energy efficiency. Again, you know, some of the local governments are utilizing this, but there are still technologies to be developed to really better that technology, make it more efficient. I've worked a couple projects where, you know, people get very emotional about, they have, you know, a solar farm they want to put up, but they are waiting for an RPS from the state in order for it to be feasible for their investors. Well, yeah, it's tricky in those regards when you break down the numbers. The technology now just isn't allowing the numbers to benefit, you know, the private side. So,
great, Carrie. Thank you. Linda?
Well, I think it's very important to focus on what you can implement in the short term also, and what is going to have the most impact, the highest payoff. So if I were queen for the day, I would want to see this region establish 1 to 3 high priority goals with a shared bottom line for all of the service and resource providers and private sector and public partners. And I think it's important to let private sector lead in terms of the gaps and deficiencies in terms of what they need, because in the end they are the ones that are creating the jobs. And I think that the public sector and philanthropy and NGOs and nonprofits need to think about how they can come together and align their resources and assets around the needs of those private sector folks. And so I guess in essence I think thinking about how you bring education, workforce development, economic development, R&D, all of the shareholders that have a stake in this region, in the prosperity of this region, and if they can align themselves around some very high-level, top priority goals with very specific action plans and initiatives, but think about how folks can put skin in the game, not necessarily look to the feds for all of the answers or the state for all of the answers, because it really does I think, need to happen at the local regional level. And I think the feds will look upon that, just to answer Dale's comment. The feds are very interested in this region, clearly. They want to see that folks are working together, that there's a track record of that, that folks have skin in the game at all levels. And so I think given that, it makes a lot of sense to articulate and ask, but I think we also need to do our part to be able to say these are our very specific high priority goals, and they cut across a lot of different critical areas. But
thank you, Linda. One of your early questions from the audience was, how do we get this alignment between all levels of organizations and entities? And I think with the leaders demonstrated who are sitting on this panel today, we are in good stead. We have a great start to this. Let's keep it going. On behalf of the audience panelists, thank you so much for what you do every day.